If you would, open up to the Gospel of Matthew. We'll talk about that after class, now that the recording started. So, all right. Matthew chapter 1. As you all decided, in terms of wanting to study through the Gospel of Matthew, we talked about specifically that we're going to aim to look at how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. We're going to see how God utilized women in achieving His will in terms of the gospel accounts of what's going on there, as well as looking at what we find in the Gospel of Matthew and making sure that we make some New Testament applications as we go, because of course the New Covenant doesn't really begin until Jesus' resurrection, ascension, and you could maybe even go as far out as to the day of Pentecost, which is in Acts chapter 2. And so to make sure that we're making right parallels and applications through those things. Now, let's start at the very beginning. Looking at verse 1, it says, "The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Now, there's 63 generations from Adam all the way down to Jesus. And to think 63 generations may not sound like a lot of generations. And keep in mind, some of the people in the earlier generations are living into their 700s, 800s, 900s. And it covers a span of over 4,000 years. And to think, that's a pretty big chunk of time. As part of these things, has anybody ever studied your own ancestry? Okay. And you kind of go back through, and as you start to kind of dive in and kind of unravel and figure things out, do you ever run into people that you go, man, this is really neat? People who did maybe some amazing things, some people who did things that you just go, wow, and I think I'm actually related to these people. At the same time, there's also a balance in that, because what else can you discover? The bank robbers. You realize you can also discover, I'm related to some people who are pretty scummy. And so as you go through, you realize there's a balance in there of going, all right, what about for my future, the future generations that are coming? Are they going to look back on being related to me and go, hey, that's great? Or are they going to go, well, let's just not talk about him or her? And so as you look through this genealogy, we're not going to cover the whole thing this morning. We'll do well if we can cover 6 verses, because of trying to take this aim of looking at how God utilized women, specifically through these things. Now, if you've already read down through, the genealogy of Jesus, what women do you know are mentioned by name? Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. She actually is mentioned by name here. So you think about, here's 4, and to go, out of those 4, how many of them would consider to be black sheep? You have Tamar, who has her own ordeal in Genesis 38. You have Rahab, who's a harlot. You have Ruth, who's a foreigner from a Moabitess. And you have Bathsheba, who's an adulteress. You going to brag about any of those? Maybe not initially, but yet what does the Lord do? There's a big change of life too. And you realize sometimes you only get half the story, right? There's certain aspects of all of our lives that if that's the only thing that people knew, they'd go, ugh. There's other aspects of our lives that people might go, oh, that's great. Now, looking at just verse 1 again, what do you see about what Matthew's aim is? What does he want people to initially know about what he's writing? Think about, number one, this is the Messiah. And if you notice the way he talks about it, Jesus, and of course Jesus means Savior, to go, Jesus the Messiah. Now who does that really perk up the ears of? Jews. Because what goes with the Messiah from the Old Testament? All these prophecies about the coming Messiah. And so for any one of those Jews who is looking to figure out who the Messiah is, was, or would be, to go, this is the gospel account for you. So what do you automatically know from just reading the first verse of the Gospel of Matthew? Who is Matthew's audience? Jews. I mean, it's no secret. He hits it right from the beginning. So you look here and go, Jesus the Messiah. Then you see the connection to know he's the son of David. And then to also know he's a son of Abraham. Now, with all these things together, and if you think in terms of what does just the term gospel mean? Good news. So let's talk about the good news. I think about the Messiah has come. He's the descendant of David. He's the descendant of Abraham. And so as you look at how things get put together, I want you to see from the Old Testament, because remember, we're going to try and highlight some of these Old Testament prophecies and see how Jesus came to fulfill them. So the introduction, just in the first verse, Messiah, descendant of David, descendant of Abraham. Go back to the Old Testament. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, we're not going to read this whole aspect here, but just kind of starting halfway through verse 11. And this is after David decided he wanted to build a house for God. And Nathan's initial response was, that's a fantastic idea. Go do it with all your heart. And then that night, God comes to Nathan and says, go tell David he's not going to be the one who's going to build it. His son is going to be the one who builds it. Then, as part of these things, God gives this information to Nathan and says for him to tell it to David. But verse 11, midway through the verse, it says, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. Now remember, initially, what did David want to do for God? I want to make a house for you. I want to make a temple, a permanent structure, not a tabernacle like a tent. And now God says, I see what you want to do for me. And do you see how God just turns it right around? He says, I'm going to make a house for you. Now, is he talking about a physical house? He's going to talk about a promise. Now, here's where it continues, verse 12. Now he's going to take something a little bit different. He says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. Now, who's he talking about here? Solomon. Now, he says, your descendant after you, and then notice the next part, verse 13. Here's how you know the difference. He says, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne, the throne of his kingdom forever. So now notice, what God's going to use Solomon to do on the physical side, now, who's going to be used on the spiritual side of this promise? Here's where Jesus comes in. So, but I want you to notice verse 14 is not going to fit with Jesus, but it will fit with Solomon. He says, verse 13, he shall build a house for my name, and of course Solomon did, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And realize, because Solomon's going to be the son of David, and it's going to keep on going through the kings of Judah. Then verse 14, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Now this part sounds like Jesus and Solomon both, right? He says, I'm going to be a father, going to be a son. So it should be no surprise that the Messiah is going to be the Son of God, and also a son of David. But here, once again, here's the part where it's not talking about Jesus. This is just about Solomon. The next statement in verse 14, when he commits iniquity, well, who do you know we're not talking about? We're not talking about Jesus. So that's why you have to be careful with these things. He says, when he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. How was God going to discipline Solomon and the descendants of Solomon? Other nations. He says all of a sudden other nations would come in and they might even battle against Judah or Israel. He says, and they might even take them off into captivity. Then, verse 15. He says, but my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul when whom I removed from before you. So now, see the contrast? Did David know what it was like whenever God removed his spirit from Saul? I mean, who was Saul throwing the spears at? David. And who did God use to soothe even Saul's spirit after he had gone away? David comes in to play the harp. And you realize David got a front row seat of what it's like to lose the Spirit of God. To see how good it can be, because Saul early in his life was a great king. But then all of a sudden, when his heart turned away from God, God's Spirit left him. And then everything for Saul all went downhill from there. Until he basically just destroys himself in the end. And so here's God saying, I'm not going to take my Spirit away from your descendant, Solomon, like I did from Saul. He says, I'm going to remain to be a father. In other words, I'm going to continue to discipline, which is actually a blessing. Then, verse 15, he says, my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Verse 16, your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. And of course, who's God really talking about here? This is about Jesus is going to take this. Now, it's going to be carried down from generation to generation down through, but eventually we're going to come to Jesus. And then when Jesus sits on the throne of David, there won't be another descendant after that. He'll be there forever. So, and of course, verse 17, in accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So Nathan tells these things to David, and of course, from this point on, David starts to gather up all the materials to build the temple. But there's something else I want you to see about this promise. And this is about the throne of David, and these things get repeated later. But look over at Jeremiah chapter 33. Jeremiah chapter 33. We're going to start in verse 19. I want you to see how foundational and established this promise is. Not only with God, but also to see how it was to be remembered. And really remembered on a daily basis, if you ever took the time to do so. Jeremiah 33, look at verse 19. Jeremiah 33, and actually, since we're here, we'll go ahead and read 14 and 15. He says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good words which I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. He says, I want you to know I'm going to fulfill my promises. I gave them to Judah, I gave them to Israel. Verse 15. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness on the earth. Now, who is Jeremiah speaking of? Jesus. The righteous branch, he says, of David. And that's exactly the way that he's talked about in the New Testament. But here's the aspect. What do you know about the reign of Jesus? What will it always be in? Two things in particular. What does he bring up? justice and righteousness. You can know no matter whatever happens on this planet, God will always execute. Jesus will always execute. Since he sits on the throne, it's always going to be in terms of righteousness and justice. And it's not necessarily a minute-to-minute kind of thing of, oh, I did something that's not right, so now I'm going to suffer severely in this next second. No. Sometimes he lets nations rise up, but what do you know is coming? Justice and righteousness. It says justice is always going to be balanced against what's righteous. Now, look down a little bit further, like verse 19. He says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, saying, thus says the Lord, if you can break my covenant for the day and my covenant for the night, so that day and night will not be at their appointed time, then my covenant may also be broken with David my servant, so that he will not have a son to reign on his throne, and with the Levitical priests my ministers. What was God pointing to? What can you look at and tell that God's going to be faithful to his covenant? Day and night. He says, if you ever wonder whether I'm going to keep my promise with someone sitting on the throne of David, what can you look at? He says, just see if you can break my covenant with day and night. See if you can alter and change that. Can you make it to where it's no longer going to be brighter during the day than it is at night? Can you change whether it's going to be dark at night rather than during the day? He says, do you have any say-so at all in that? We know we don't. And they go, he says, then what do you know about this promise to the throne of David? It's unbreakable. In other words, this covenant has very little to do with you. Right? He says, I'm going to keep my promises. And that's the wonderful thing about this. So as he talks about these things, notice how it continues into verse 22. As the host of heaven cannot be counted and the sand of the sea cannot be measured, so I will multiply the descendants of David, my servant, and the Levites who minister to me. What does he compare these things to? He says, can you count the stars? Can you count the sands of the sea? I mean, I laugh at that every time I go to a beach. I hope you do too. Whenever you go there, I always do it. Maybe it's just me. I always reach down and grab up a handful of sand and try and get a small enough pile to where I can actually count how many grains there are. And I usually get it down pretty small because I'm not that smart. And then I look at what's in my hand, and then I try to look down the beach all the way to the left until it hits the horizon, and all the way to the right until it hits the horizon, and look behind me at how far it goes, and just think in terms of, that's a lot of descendants. And so you realize once again, he says, you can't count it, you can't measure it, but what about God? He can. He could give you an exact number. That just blows my mind. Now, if you notice the comparison here that he brings up, he also said in Matthew 1, Jesus the Messiah, he says the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now let's look at one of those promises. Look back at Genesis chapter 22. Genesis 22, we're going to start in verse 15. Of course, earlier on in the chapter is about whenever God calls Abraham to offer up his son, or Abram to offer up his son Isaac. And Abraham goes through it. He does it exactly the way that God says until it comes to that point where he would actually slay Isaac. The ram's caught in the thicket behind him. Then, verse 15. He says, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. Now notice, what he tells as a promise to David later on, he has already established in a promise with Abraham. So these promises have already been in place. And so you look at these things as they continue on down and go, just because Abraham was willing to say, I will kill my only son, I will be faithful to you even if it makes no sense whatsoever to me. I will do your will and not mine. In the same way, you see how God used the faith of Abraham. He says, because of this faith response, and you can read about it in Hebrews 11, Abraham was contemplating when he was going up to offer up Isaac. He knew about God's promise through Isaac. So he knew Isaac would have to live. And he went ahead and thought it out. He says, you know what? I'm going to offer him up as a burnt offering. He's going to be nothing but ash. He says, and he had planned apparently to just sit there until God raised that ash back up from the dead. Because he told the servants in Genesis 22, we will return. Talking about we being Isaac and me are coming back. And Hebrews 11 talks about he reckoned that God would just raise him up from the dead. What does that tell you about faith? Faith doesn't look at God in terms of limitations. Faith looks at God in terms of God will keep his promises. And because that's the way Abraham saw God, it makes God turn to make these statements that we're reading about. He says, I have sworn it myself. And you think in those terms, the things that are impossible for God, he's never going to lie. And so if he says something and he says, and I've sworn by myself, what do you know? You have a reassurance even above the normal reassurance, right? Because he doesn't lie. He always keeps his promises. So the fact that he is saying, I have declared this and I have sworn it by myself. In other words, there is no reason to ever doubt me to begin with, and I give my word. But whenever I declare it and I swear by myself, don't even consider the thought that it's not going to happen. It may not happen in your timing, and it may not happen the way you imagine, but he will keep it. So he brings up these same things from old. Then verse 18, here we come to Jesus. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. This verse is actually quoted over in Romans. And the applications to who? Jesus. He says, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And notice why. Because of faithful obedience. And if you think about the life of Jesus, why are we so blessed in him? It's because of his faithful obedience. And if we want to be blessed by God, it's going to have to be out of faithful obedience. Even whenever what he commands, we look at and we go, I don't understand why. To be like Abraham, I don't understand why God wants me to go offer up Isaac, but I'm going to do it. And I'm going to be faithful to it. And I'm going to consider by faith what God can do with this. And you realize, does that encourage you in those moments or discourage you? It encourages us. Now, you can see why through these things. Come back over to Matthew chapter 1. You can see why Matthew opens up with Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. As if to say, if you're Jewish, you know you're supposed to be looking for the Messiah. You know the promises about the throne of David. And you know the promises about the seed that all the nations are going to be blessed through a descendant of Abraham. It's almost like here's a whole lot of foreshadowing just in one verse. Now here's the one thing we haven't really talked about. It says The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. What does Messiah mean? Okay. Messiah literally means the anointed one. The anointed one. Now, I just want you to think about what you already know about the life of Christ. What all is Jesus anointed with? There's multiple things. It's not just one. Okay, he's anointed with oil and perfume. You can think about different characters there. All right. He's anointed with the Spirit, and the Spirit comes in the form of a dove when he's baptized. That's going to be Matthew chapter 3 when we get there. There's other aspects that are not in the same literal sense, like with a dove. Is Jesus anointed with sin whenever he dies for us? Is he anointed with life when he's raised from the dead? I mean, you start to see some things that are pretty vast. Anointed with the Spirit of God, anointed with sin, our sin, anointed with life, even his words. When he speaks, they're words of life. Now, so often you think in these terms of going, he's also anointed with blood in those situations. Think about whenever he's crucified. I mean, they have slammed down that crown of thorns on his head. And there's an anointing. And don't think of anointing as a baptism. Just think of anointing in terms of, it's been poured out on top of you. And I mean, think of what that would be like as Jesus is being crucified, for those drops of blood to just be coming down and to see through them. And when you see those ideas in terms of Messiah, I don't want you to ever forget that aspect of the anointed and to realize what all he's been anointed with. I mean, there are some things he's been anointed with that are pretty outstanding in terms of what's good. Spirit, oil, perfume. There's other things that are a little bit more gut-wrenching in terms of anointed in blood, anointed with our sin, and then the overcoming and anointed with life in his resurrection. And then you think anointed as a king in his ascension. All these things together should help us to look forward through the whole book of Matthew of going, pay attention to all these promises that are in the past. Pay attention to what God has promised would happen and be on the lookout for them with Jesus. The great thing about the Gospel of Matthew, since it is written to Jews, you will see it time and time and time again. And this he did to fulfill what was written by the prophet Isaiah, or what was written by the prophet Hosea, or by the prophet. He'll go through these different things. And if you were a Jew, it was like, maybe this really is the Messiah. Even if you had made up your mind the other way. And all of a sudden you start reading through and going, man, he matches up. He's the branch, the righteous branch of David. He is the one that's going to bring blessings to all the nations. Because his blood's going to be available to all the nations. And you start working your way through and seeing those things. Let's take this to a little different turn since we're still in the first verse. We know that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And I just want you to notice Matthew does mention himself twice in the book. And if you'll notice, he doesn't mention himself in any great pomp or circumstance. But he does mention himself, and maybe it'll help us a little bit to see some things as we go through the book. Look over at Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, look at verse 9. Jesus has been up in Cana, and so, well, not Cana, but in Capernaum. And if you remember the man who's been let down through the roof, paralytic, been healed, son, your sins are forgiven you. Right after that, you get verse 9. Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, from Capernaum, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? I mean, here's Matthew, which tells you what's his job. Pretty well known. He's a tax collector. He's just sitting in the booth and collecting taxes, and all of a sudden, Jesus comes walking through and gives him this great big old long invitation of why he should come and join him and how it's going to affect him and all. Not really. He just says, "Follow me." And what stirs within Matthew? Okay, I'll do it. And sure enough, he got up and followed him. It's just that simple. I mean, it's not some dramatic story, but Matthew tells you, and this is where I came in, which is kind of unique because you realize from Matthew 9:9, everything that's written, Matthew is right there to see. He's not just writing things down that he heard. And you go, a first-person account. Now, here's the other aspect of this. Who do people not seem to be so keen on? Tax collectors. Well, even present day, isn't it amazing how that hasn't changed a whole lot? But at the same time, you look at it and go, all those different things, and Jesus is going to make some pretty poignant statements about tax collectors, about you're going to have to go beyond what tax collectors do. And think about what that would mean to Matthew. I've got to go beyond what's normal. I can't just be average. I've really got to do it his way. And of course, then if you look over at Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 1. It says, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. So he summons 12 disciples, and out of the 12, and then verse 2. Now the names of the 12 apostles, now just make a little footnote for yourself. It says apostles here in chapter 10, verse 2. That is the only time the word apostle is going to be used in the whole book of Matthew. One and only. That's why whenever it goes through so many stories that Matthew tells, he's just going to say, and the disciples. The 12. No, they're not one and the same. Here's why. A disciple was someone who was going to follow Jesus. They wanted Jesus to be their rabbi. In other words, they wanted to imitate Jesus in how they lived their life, how they thought, what their motives were, what they should do, what they should not do. An apostle was also a disciple, but an apostle had been sent out with authority like an ambassador, like we think of a present-day ambassador being sent to another country. An apostle was sent out, and if you notice, what kind of authority did Jesus give them? Well, look back at verse 1. What could they do that the other disciples couldn't do? They could have authority over unclean spirits. They could cast them out. They could heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. There's going to be a little play on that later on in the book. There's going to be a time where they can't. And they're going to start wondering, what's going on here? We'll deal with that later. But verse 2, he says, now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Verse 3, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. Notice he goes ahead and throws it. This is Matthew the tax collector. He says, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Right from the get-go, as soon as you get introduced to Judas, what do you know? You will be betrayed. Now, through all of these things together, you just understand Matthew's point of view through these things. Here he is coming from a tax collector background. At the same time, he also is an apostle, not just a disciple. So the things that he's doing, to think, the very person that wrote the Gospel of Matthew could cast out unclean spirits, could heal diseases, and had been sent out by the authority of Jesus. And you go, you're not dealing with just a commoner. And that's something we need to remember. So, notice back in Matthew chapter 1, look at verse 2. It says, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. Now, you start getting these generations from one to the next. And what's at hand here? We get introduced to our first lady. Now, here, of course, is Tamar. How many of you remember the story of Judah and Tamar from Genesis chapter 38? How many of you are familiar with that story? Miriam is, Janet is, Lois, Kathy. You start to realize, I'm not going to go through all those details. Thank you, by the way. But if you want to go back and read Genesis 38, I'll let you go back through it. I'll give you a little quick summary of it to give you a little bit of an idea of these things, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. But Judah, of course, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, or Israel, he has 3 sons, E-R, Onan, O-N-A-N, and Shelah, or Shelah, S-H-E-L-A-H. And a woman by the name of Tamar marries the oldest son, Well, is evil in the eyes of God, and so God actually, it specifically says that so the Lord took his life. And so what does that make Tamar? A widow. And even though there's no law in place, because this is before Moses, where, a brother's supposed to come in and raise up a child, and have a descendant, because descendants matter, right? So Tamar is given to Onan, the next brother, in terms of to have a relationship, to raise up a son, and Onan's so despicable that he doesn't carry through with that all the way. And the Lord comes in again and says, so he took his life also, because he wouldn't do what he was supposed to do. Then there's a third son whose name is Shelah, and he's supposed to be the next one, but Shelah's just a little bit younger. And so Judah, who's he doesn't use this terminology, but it's as if Judah's looking at Tamar going, she's a black widow. Everybody that marries her dies. But that's not the case at all. It's not her fault. She's been the one who's been relatively pure through these things. And as part of it, he will not allow Shelah to marry her until he becomes of age. Well, time passes, and a considerable amount of time, and Judah's own wife passes away. And Judah, who you can tell is not going to be a godly man himself, decides that he's going to go to a town and he's looking for a prostitute. Well, Tamar sees that Shelah is now of age. It's been so many years, and yet she has not been given to him. And so she takes off her widow's clothing and puts on the clothing of a prostitute. Typically, prostitutes would shave their head. Typically, they would be clothed in a certain way, usually kind of long clothing. And so Judah hires her out. Not something you probably want in your lineage. And so they have a relationship. They make an agreement beforehand, and it says, I'll pay you a goat for these services. Anyway. So she says, well, what can I have to show that you'll actually bring the goat? You can tell, she's pretty wise in one sense, pretty evil in another. But he says, well, here's my seal, my signet ring, and here's a cord, and here's my staff. He says, and so you can keep those until I bring the goat, and then you'll give those back to me. Crazy transaction going on here. Quite evil on a lot of different levels. But at the same time, so this happens. He goes back home. He sends actually one of his good friends and says, hey, I want you to take this goat to this woman, and she'll give you my signet ring and my cord and my staff, and this will all be behind us. Doesn't this just sound so ridiculous? I mean, and yet that's the way evil sounds, right? It should sound to us ridiculous. Be afraid whenever evil sounds smart. That's where we really need to be concerned. And so the friend goes back, his name's Hiram, and he goes and he brings these things, but he can't find a woman that fits this description, because as soon as they have this intimacy deal, all of a sudden between Judah and Tamar, she puts back on her widow clothes. And so he comes to make the payment, can't find her, and he goes back, and Judah's like, I don't know what else to do. He says, I guess you'll just keep them. And then all of a sudden, about 3 months later, all of a sudden it's found out that Tamar's pregnant. Well, self-righteous Judah comes to find out, and he says, you know what? She should be killed for what she's done. She's not been faithful to the Lord. What a hypocrite. What a hypocrite. And so he comes to confront her, and this is where she turns and makes her statement about this child is by Judah. And then all of a sudden the bell rings. Oh. And Judah makes a statement and says, she's more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. Then he knew it. They never had relations again. And then, of course, 6 months later, she gives birth to 2 children. One by the name of Perez and the other by the name of Zerah. Whenever she goes to give birth, because she does have twins, and this is quite a birth story, all of a sudden, the first son, it's a breech birth, and in some way his hand is delivered, and they tie a scarlet thread onto the finger, and then the hand goes back into the womb. I may not be using the right medical terms here. And then, all of a sudden, Perez is born first. And then comes Zerah, who has the scarlet thread on his finger. And you go, twins. Instead of just having one descendant, now there are 2. And to go, and one of them is halfway born first, but the other one's fully born first. And what's going on? Who's the firstborn? It's hard to tell, right? But through all of these things, you realize, even in their wickedness, was God still going to preserve his promise? Yes. Does that mean God was saying, okay, we're just going to use the wicked way this time? No. God was going to keep his promises. Remember, is it dependent upon you? Do you change the sun and the day and the night? No, I'm going to keep my promise, even if I have to use wicked people as instruments. And so here's Tamar. Now, later on, Tamar is going to be blessed whenever you start getting a little bit further down when we get to the story of Ruth, which I think we're probably not going to get to today. But if you notice what's in place here, as it continues on, if you notice in verse 3, he says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. It says, here's Tamar who gets mentioned. And you look at this and you go, is this a story you would really want to tell to your descendants? I mean, whenever I was teaching the young people, middle school, high school age, and we went through the study of Genesis, I always cringed when we got to 38. I was like, should I even cover this? Is this worthwhile? And so it was a good time to say, all right, kids, just close your Bibles and listen to me tell you the story of Genesis 38. And I'll do a little bit of editing along the way. But at the same time, there are other times where they needed to know, you can be faithful to the Lord in these things or you cannot. And it can change your life one way or the other too. So it depends on who the group was. But if you notice what's in place, God keeping his promise. God keeping his promise to Abraham. This is even before Abraham and David. But God knowing, I know what I'm going to promise to Abraham. I know what I'm going to promise to David. I know about the Messiah is going to be the descendant of David. And it just so happens that Jesus is from what tribe? Tribe of Judah. And you realize, look at what God is already putting in place. And you think you're dealing a good 2,000 years before Jesus. Now, you tell me, do you think God knows what's going to happen in our lives? If he can go ahead and working out plans 2,000 years in advance. On Wednesday night, when we talk about Genesis 1, there are things that he put in place from the first week of creation that were going to be for people for the rest of time. Promises, things that he was foreshadowing, things he was putting together. If we ever think God doesn't know what's coming in our lives, and to also realize that the words that he's given are so that we can be prepared for whatever event may come in our lives, we don't realize the grandeur of who God is and the grandeur of his wisdom and how infinitely small our wisdom is until we rely on him to grant it. Now, you look at this and you see what's at hand in verse 3. Then he continues on. And once again, this is one of those things of, I just imagine anytime you're dealing with ancestry, of children or grandchildren saying, would you tell me the story of Judah and Tamar? That story is rated about PG-30. You come back in a few more years and I'll tell you all about it. But notice how it continues here in verse 3. He says, Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. And you come to a man by the name of Salmon, and probably at first initial thought, Salmon may not mean a whole lot to you, but he means more to you than you think he does on several different layers, because of the next verse tells you why. Verse 5. Salmon was the father of Boaz. You probably more easily recognize Boaz's name than you do Salmon's name. But without Salmon, that Boaz story probably doesn't unravel the way it does. Because you realize what Salmon does paves the way for Boaz to readily take Ruth as his wife. Because he knows who his mom is. Because who is Salmon's mother? Rahab the harlot. Now, she wasn't Rahab the harlot whenever Boaz comes along. But I venture to say he knew that about the past. Right. And so you see this foreigner aspect of Rahab being assumedly from Jericho or somewhere in that vicinity. So when you look at verse 5, I mean, there's a lot to think in terms of to go back in your mind. And really through all the genealogy, many of these people that we go, that name's not familiar to me. Not all of them have a story in the Old Testament, but many of them do. And some of them are fantastic. And we won't even cover them just because it takes so long to cover it. But specifically here in verse 5, he says, Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. If you think about how Rahab is mentioned in the New Testament, look over at Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Look at verse 30 and 31. Let's deal with the first one, then we'll deal with the second one. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Why is it by faith? They did what he told them. I mean, you mean we're just supposed to march around this city? 1 lap a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, we're going to take a few more laps and blow some trumpets and have this order just right, and then all the walls are going to fall down? Okay. I mean, I hope you're thinking back to Abraham. Like, I'm not sure why he wants me to offer up my only son Isaac as a burnt offering, but if that's what the Lord desires, that's what I'll do. And because of that attitude, you see what happened with Abraham, and now you see what's going to happen in Jericho. It tells you about Israel going, all right, we'll march it. We'll march it off. We'll do it. And I can only imagine how the people in Jericho thought whenever seeing these people just march around. It's like a nice parade. Don't know how that's going to help you. But then, of course, then it happens. Verse 31, by faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And if you remember the story of Rahab, and you can read far more about that in Joshua chapter 2 and Joshua chapter 6. But if you remember whenever the spies show up in Jericho, she takes them and she hides them up in the flax that's on the roof of her house. It's actually on the wall of Jericho. And as part of that, whenever the officials come and ask her, I mean, she just flat out lies about that she knows what's going on with them. She even lies to the point of telling them, yeah, they headed out east. He says, you go chase them down. You can probably catch them. They haven't even left yet. And you realize, is God willing to use us even in our ignorance at the beginning? I mean, she's ignorant of a lot of things of God, but one thing she's not ignorant of is God's power. And if you read about it in Joshua chapter 2, whenever she does talk to the spies, she says, you know what? We've been scared to death. Our hearts melted 40 years ago whenever we heard that God had led you across the Red Sea on dry ground. Which tells you the promised land had been ripe for the picking 40 years ago. Who didn't have faith then? The Israelites, right? How are the Israelites now? No? What have they just done? They had crossed the Jordan, and now are they being faithfully obedient to walk around, to march around Jericho? See, now they have faithful obedience. You see a different people, right? So those 40 years in the wilderness, did they make a big difference in the nation of Israel? Monumental. Now, does it mean they all did everything right? No. But you realize there's been a change of heart in Israel, and that was needed. And so whenever this conversation happens with Rahab and these two spies, she tells them, well, since I've taken care of you, will you take care of me? And if you remember, that's whenever they give the agreement. He says, since you've taken care of us, if you'll let this scarlet cord out of the window, he says, and keep it out there. He says, we'll remember to spare you and your family, anyone who is in your house. Now, if they leave your house, their blood's on their own head, but to stay in here. And then she gives them some wise counsel and says, go up to the west to the mountains and stay up there for 3 days. And then after 3 days, go back to where Israel is, east. And if you think about what she tells the officials, you go out to the east and look for them. They're looking for somebody who's not even there if they're headed east. He says, meanwhile, the spies are camped up here just kicking back, enjoying life for a few days. And then all of a sudden, that search party comes back. Now they just tail around and they go on back to where Israel is and taken care of. But you realize at the same time of looking at Rahab, I mean, I don't know of any righteous people that would ever honor a harlot. And yet at the same time, what does this story tell you? If she would respond out of faith, which she did, even though she doesn't do everything right, was God willing to use her in an honorable way? And she wasn't a harlot any longer. She didn't come to Israel to be the new harlot. And so, all of a sudden, here's the story that unfolded in whatever way it did. At some point, after Rahab and her family were spared in Jericho, after the walls fell down, and Israel utterly destroyed them, except for Achan's sin, at some point, Salmon looked across and saw Rahab the harlot. And did what? Come into my house. Not as a harlot. Come in as a wife. Come in as a foreigner into my household. And you go, that must have been something. That's one of those conversations, one of those situations I'd like to know more about. Because what does that tell you about the heart of Solomon? He cares. He cares enough to do something that was uncommon. And to go, you know what? Typically we can't have anything to do. He says, you're a woman of faith. Because you know what everybody knew in Israel? They all knew that she had put that thread out the window. They had marched around every day and saw that thread, that scarlet cord. Maybe thread's not the right word. And they knew that whoever was in that household should be spared. Because that's where a faithful woman and her family was, who had a great faith in Israel about the power of God and his strength. And to go, for Salmon, he said to himself at some point, I don't care if she's a foreigner, I'm going to marry her. And he did. And because he did, they had a son. And his name was Boaz. And hopefully next week we can come back and talk a little bit more about how God not only used Tamar and how God used Rahab, but move on to another one. All right. Enjoy the rest of the week.